remember seeing Dr. Zhivago very well. I grew up in New York, and those big roadshow pictures were part of my movie-going experience.
My clearest memory of movies of that era, and David Lean in particular, was it was a much more patient kind of immersive experience, including the intermission. It was a grander afternoon at the movies.
I actually was a projectionist when I was in school, and I just loved, pulling the curtains at the right time, having the intermission, start the music again. It just felt like show.
Like with all David Lean's films, you just sit back and it's like a huge event.
When I was a kid, Lawrence of Arabia made such an impression upon me, and when it won the Oscars, Bridge on the River Kwai was then re-released wide. And then suddenly, this romance was coming. So the expectations were high, all based on the name David Lean.
In the 60s, I was in the School of International Relations, and the people at MGM said, we'd like to do a screening for the students at USC of Dr. Zhivago, David Lean's new picture. And I got a bunch of people together. We started selling tickets around campus. I kind of introduced it, and then this movie started, and it grabbed me and held me all the way to the end.
I have this vivid memory of Dr. Zhivago just being obsessed with this movie. And I think I ended up seeing the movie about 25 times. And to this day, there's imagery that I can't get out of my head.
David wrote a letter to John Box, his production designer, a week after Lawrence of Arabia won all the Oscars. And he said that Carlo Ponti had come after him with this novel. It was Dr. Zhivago. Everyone knew the name Dr. Zhivago because it was very controversial. The Soviets wouldn't permit Pasternak to accept the Nobel Prize. David was attracted to it because he just felt the emotions in it were very honest and real. Though David was very romantic, he was cold and aloof, but I could see how he would be touched. And, here were deep Russian passions contained in this novel.
The Russian novel is a specific literary form. Some people think the greatest literary form that the novel has ever experienced. Pasternak came into that tradition, and you have in Dr. Zhivago the opportunity to see this kind of transition from one kind of economic situation to another, and the pain that it involves.
It isn't typhus. It's another disease we don't have in Moscow, starvation.
What Lean and Robert Bolt did was they organized it, they dramatized it. A lot of the things that Boris Pasternak couldn't come flat out and say in the novel, living and working in Soviet Russia, David Lean and Robert Bolt had no compunction about criticizing communism as a sort of soulless and disciplinarian regime.
But they're telling a very personal story against a historical backdrop. They're not attempting to tell the history.
Now!
It's very important for you to understand the historical context, and it's very important for you to understand the evolution of history because it's about the Russian Revolution, but it's seen through these character eyes. And what's really interesting about Zhivago is that because he's a doctor, he transcends politics. Because he's both a doctor and a poet, he transcends politics. And Lean is a very simple guy, and he's about emotion, and Robert Bolt was very, very straightforward in his storytelling. They understood the power of driving the movie with visuals and telling it in simple sort of building blocks and pieces.
To this day, I keep Robert Bolt's scripts sitting on my desk because it's so rare that you ever get anything that remotely compares to the economy in his writing. And I think it is a lesson that plays into the modern day screenplay and something that many, many screenwriters could learn from.
The great thing about, as with most of Lean's work, is he has these vast palettes, these vast landscapes, I mean, unbelievable kind of backdrops, and yet the stories are so personal. That's what's so great. And of course, the relationship between Yuri and Lara, despite the vast canvases, you focus in on the personal story, which is where his genius was, really. He certainly was a romantic. You can see that in Zhivago.
What's interesting is, these are morally conflicted, morally ambiguous characters. He is carrying on an adulterous relationship, and I think that there would be more judgment if you were trying to tell this story today in many ways. You could easily hear a studio note saying, I don't know how I feel about him if he's carrying on this affair. And these characters are not perfect by any means, and they're all tremendously flawed.
I am not coming back.
I understand.
But never, Lara.
He's not a totally sympathetic character, but he's Omar Sharif. I mean, he looks so great, and he has this kind of passive, rather wonderful aura about him that, of course, you fall in love with him, really. You forgive him for any of those sins.
I think what's interesting is that everything about the story plays against his character. His character is essentially a backdrop. He's the poet of the story.
I used to admire your poetry.
Thank you.
I shouldn't admire it now.
He doesn't actively motivate the story or drive the narrative necessarily. He reacts.
I hate everything you say, but not enough to kill you for it.
There's an incredible sensitivity to Sharif's performance, a kind of empathy and an almost sort of soft, gentle aspect to the performance.
Omar, was a romantic leading man, especially in Egypt at the time. You look at him and you sigh. But he plays a romantic figure, a poet caught up in the Russian Revolution.
But cutting out the tumors of injustice, that's a deep operation. Someone must keep life alive while you do it, by living. Isn't that right?
Julie Christie is utterly... her image still remains as one of the most beautiful-looking women ever on screen.
David was told several times by Carlo Ponti, the producer, Sophia Loren, Carlo Ponti's wife, should play Lara. And David just laughed and said, well, convince me that she can play a 17-year-old virgin.
I've no amorous experience, if that's what you mean. None whatever. Lara's 17. That speaks for itself.
Julie Christie's character from the outset, you have tremendous sympathy with her, but it was very sophisticated the way they dealt with her dual relationship with Rod Steiger and with this young idealistic Bolshevik who she was originally in love with.
Thanks, comrade.
Darling, I'm not your comrade.
With him, she was innocent, and with Steiger, she had completely lost her innocence, and yet it was a part of her that was drawn to him.
Victor, don't.
What?
Torment me.
Torment? Oh, what a little hypocrite it is.
David Lean certainly understood beautiful women, and I think that he recognized that the power in Julie Christie's performance are her eyes, and David captured that phenomenally. You always knew her emotional state.
We've not done anything you'll have to lie about, Tonya. I don't want you to have to lie about me.
Lean knew how to introduce a character. Geraldine Chaplin in Pink, leaning out of a window. Pink shows up. She enters the story. She enters the frame.
Geraldine Chaplin's character, much like Yuri's character in an interesting way, everything about what's unfolding with the story, she's reacting to, but she's internalizing it.
What happened to Nurse Antipova? Your letters were full of her.
She's gone home to her little girl.
Oh, we shan't see her then.
No.
What a pity.
She's interesting. At the beginning, she's kind of girlish and weak, but over the course of time, you realize she's quite a substantial person. And she knows, as any woman would, that she's not really worshipped. She's a convenience. But she's a rather strong person who realizes ultimately in this piece that he loves somebody else, but abides.
And then you do understand that she so completely understood what had happened with the relationship between Yuri and Laura. And Geraldine Chaplin's character has to sit and observe without comment. And I think that that is a very, very difficult kind of character to play.
Alec Guinness opens and closes the movie.
I'm General Yevgraf Andreevich Zhivago. I'm looking for someone.
He comes off initially as extremely foreboding.
What were you doing there?
I was lost, Comrade General.
How did you come to be lost?
He He's frightening, and he's bringing this poor girl before him. I mean, who wouldn't be frightened? He actually warms up over the course of the movie. And throughout, we're treated to his admiration of Yuri.
I thought he was a happier man than me.
With Guinness, you always get a thinking character. And in his case, he's going back to his roots, wanting to find out about Zhivago, wanting to make the connection with the daughter.
People will do anything.
It was Komarovsky.
Tom Courtenay's role, he goes from the idealistic student to the hardened revolutionary. And he's nearly slaughtered when the Cossacks try to get the demonstrators out off the street. And he carries a scar with him. It's more than emotional baggage. So he's not a sympathetic character. He's there to shock, and he accomplishes that.
There were no more peaceful demonstrations. There were women and children, Lara, and they rode them down.
He is Russia. He represents everything about what's going on in this revolution. And to be able to distill that down to the essence of one character, where you can access emotionally what was going on in the country, it was just an amazing testament to his skill.
I am committed to the revolution. Nothing, not even Lara, has more importance for me.
But the most vivid character in it is the villain, is Komarovsky, is Rod Steiger's. Unbelievable. Every time he comes on the screen, it's like,
I give it to you, Yuri Andreevich. Wedding present.
He is an evil man, but he's probably the most interesting person in the whole movie.
Yuri Andreevich, you've changed, I think. Lisa, remarkably the same.
One of the things I find that is amazing is the scene where he literally rapes Julie Christie. I mean, he forces himself and he inflicts himself on her, and you despise him for it. But in the front of the scene, he's sort of giving her advice that actually makes a tremendous amount of sense and kind of comes from this weird place of detachment or experience or wisdom.
There are two kinds of men, and only two. And that young man is one kind. He is high-minded. He is pure. He's the kind of man that the world pretends to look up to and, in fact, despises.
Both things are existing in the same scene, this hideous barbarism that the scene becomes by the end, and also this weird kind of detachment.
You, my dear, are a slut.
I am not.
He kind of morphs during the course of the scene out of this detached intellect into this animal. It's an amazing performance.
The movie is very heavy on symbolism, and it's condensed in the very first scene when the action really starts. It's at the funeral of Zhivago's mother.
That wonderful shot of the funeral, he sort of had the John Ford adage of put your horizon on the top or the bottom, never in the middle. That was how he did all his landscapes.
We learn that he has been loved, but that love is taken away from him.
And he cuts to the trees and he plays the wind very strongly. And it's very lyrical at that funeral. That funeral's amazing looking. But I think also it's almost like this is infusing that boy with a sense of poetry or transcendence or a lot of other things, because what will eventually grow up and be.
He will be a poet. He will have a balalaika that will follow him. It's all there, as is the introduction of Lara's theme. So everything is set up brilliantly from the word go.
At the very beginning, you see Zhivago come out into the street of Moscow. He's going to get the trolley's gone, and he misses it. But he refuses to accept his destiny. He runs after it. And you see Julie Christie for the first time. The interesting thing to me about Lean's storytelling, and of course how he adapted the novel, is the sense of him using perhaps all the coincidences in the film to his advantage, and at the same time making certain statements. Lean uses a great many images and moments that are symbolic. For instance, it's an electric trolley, and there's sparks that happen. First electricity, sexual electricity. Here it is. They don't even know each other. They don't acknowledge each other. And that really is what cinema is all about.
David was dealing with so many events within the course of the storytelling in Zhivago and the upheaval of what was happening in Russia that the only way to really move that along was to isolate various characters and to see the impact it was having on them.
He understood in the filmmaking world what he needed to do to have economy of storytelling. For instance, in the marching scene, earlier you've established the characters, and now what you do is you have Komorowski take her to the ball. It's all red. She looks virginal in this world, which is filled with sin, right? You cut to the streets, and there is families walking peacefully in the street. Now that sequence just kind of builds. You cut back, and you see Rod Steiger and Julie Christie twirling and dancing, and then later on cut to a fantastic sequence where they're driving home in a sleigh in the snow. As they drive, you see a silhouetted, mounted person on a horse, and now you see a bunch of cavalrymen get on their horses. The sequence goes on, and then the hussars start up at a slow pace, and then they go to a gallop, and then they do a charge. You see them coming, and you see panic hit, and you see them running, and the little girl that was set up earlier, you know she's going to be sacrificed, a child. You see the tuba hit the ground. You see a gun hit there that Tom Courtenay picks up, and then you hear the carnage. It's all played on Omar Sharif's face.
The scene which stays on Yuri's face is a real attempt to leave things to the imagination of the audience while at the same time stressing his impotence in the face of what is going on.
It's 10 times more powerful. Just so much more powerful than actually seeing the violence. You know what's happening. And also you see how it affects Zhivago, which is the key to it. I mean, nowadays, of course, you'd see the full Monty. You'd see, like, swords going through people. There'd be blood and guts in all directions, you know. He did it in a way that made it so much more powerful and emotionally more powerful.
Also, it was a character piece. He's suffering. And at the end of this, you see Zhivago come out. And what does he see? He sees blood on the snow. Cut. Julie Christie saying goodbye to Rod Steiger. And she's in the sleigh. We don't know anything's happened, but we just realized from the blood in the snow that she's no longer a virgin. She's been deflowered. Lean is so fantastic in his economy. He sees something and then he pays it off two ways.
David Lean was so brilliant at staging everything, and the suicide scene is maybe still one of my favorite moments in the film, where he just lets the camera sit outside and you witness this incredibly tense experience going on inside the house. And it's so brilliantly staged. And I think there's very few filmmakers that have the experience of doing that anymore.
You know that there's been a problem because early on, when Tom Courtenay comes back from having been slashed and he asks for iodine, it comes in a blue bottle. Again, Lean has set it up earlier. He takes the iodine, he pours it on his face. And now you're at the moment where the doctors have come in. You see the bottle, you realize that she's taken that and drunk it. And at the end of the sequence, you finally see the victim. You expect to see Julie Christie's blonde hair. It's red hair. It's the mother. The mother has realized that Komorowski has taken and deflowered her daughter, that her daughter has betrayed her. She has nothing to live for. And now you have Zhivago, who's walking through a dark place, not seeing anything. And he finally comes upon a glassed-in partition, and he looks down, and all he sees is a hand on a chair. And into the room comes Komorowski, and you see that she is completely dissolved and broken apart emotionally because she knows that her mother tried to commit suicide because of what she did. Zhivago realizes she was the reason the mother committed suicide, and it's extraordinary storytelling.
David was himself a very detached individual. You never hugged him. He wasn't warm and cuddly, and I think that really came into play with Dr. Zhivago, because so much happens behind plates of glass in this movie.
In terms of Julie Christie, she's so unbelievably beautiful, and there's such a kind of a grace to her and and a real subtle complexity to the performance. I mean, the scene when she comes in with the gun to shoot Rod Steiger, it's just remarkable.
We know that Julie Christie is on the march looking for Komorowski, and she's got a gun. So there's tension building.
You don't want that engagement announced. You want her to interrupt it somehow, and she does so with a gunshot.
Doctor Zhivago is betrothed in marriage to...
It's this amazing movie moment, and yet you're so completely emotionally invested, you know, it's absolutely real for you.
Although David is known for epics, what he really was the master was the intimate epic. And he would zero in on things, take the candle. Now, there was a symbol they could always work with, and David really goes to town with it.
It's a total pantomime. Again, totally a silent scene. You know everything. You know what's in the letter, which he's basically saying, I had an affair with Victor Komorowski. I don't love you. You deserve better.
I think that David Lean understands that the audience supplies their own answers much more when you're not telling them things. And it's a way of forcing the audience to participate, which I think is brilliant that way.
And of course, Tom Courtenay, he dissolves in tears, even though he's been betrayed.
It's such a beautiful example of the collaboration of filmmaking. The photography is so brilliant.
The interesting thing is the images they got on film were no lesser than the ones we could get on film today. But then you realize what these guys were up against with the technology available at the time. And that was still fairly primitive technology. There was nothing digital. But for me, the thing that inspired me and made me so in awe of Zhivago was that it was shot by Freddie Young. And I shot my first feature when I was 19. So it was, for me, Freddie Young, it was something unattainable. And that scale of filmmaking, I've always been a big fan of that.
The party looked to the conscript peasants, most of them wearing their first good pair of boots. When the boots wore out, they'd be ready to listen.
David was always so brilliant at taking the setting and the backdrop of whatever that historical event was and bringing it back to its impact and its effect on that character, to just give it a personal resonance.
By the second winter of the war, the boots had worn out.
Compositionally, the shots are remarkable, how much they let play out within the frame. And I love that shot of the eyeglasses falling into frame. I saw that and I thought, oh, that looks like a pain in the ass to try to get those glasses to fall correctly right at that moment. And then through the glasses, having the action play out on the lens behind them is pretty. But it's all in these impressionistic little pieces, which are wonderful because you're bringing yourself to it. Your imagination is stronger than anything you can see graphically.
Act 1 of Dr. Zhivago closes with a shocker. The husband of Julie Christie, whom we're led to believe he was killed during one of the very early battles of World War I, turns out he's this much-feared revolutionary. And a quick shot, and then bam, intermission.